many of you may have heard of one of the more popular and one of the most common philosophies of the modern era, and it is called Stoicism. And this idea of life, this topic of conversation, has become common among many people, including Christians across the world. And so today we're going to look at whether or not Stoicism is an appropriate way to approach life and live life for those who believe in Jesus Christ. Now, I want to say that many of the ideas of Stoicism that you probably are familiar with, yes, it came from ancient Stoic practices, but some of it has been adapted to give it somewhat of a marketable and attractive way of reaching people. And the thing that is important about that reality is that if that was the aim, then we must initially at least consider whether or not the approach to life as it is presented through modern Stoics is actually a reliable and tested way of achieving whatever the goal might be for Stoics. And so we need to set that at the front of the conversation. But more importantly, we want to look at the fact that there were actual Stoics living during the times of Jesus Christ. There were Stoics living during the times of Jesus's first followers, and they chose to follow Christ rather than following some of the Stoic voices of their time. And so if that is the case, we need to ask the question today, what would be the value and what would be the incentive for following these Stoic principles as they have been repackaged today over following the teachings of Jesus Christ? Now, as you all know, I've had these conversations on other topics, and I personally believe that the philosopher to follow for Jesus, for Christians rather, is Jesus himself. And if you want to understand how to live, you study his followers. But that does not mean that we cannot learn from the wisdom of other individuals. We just need to understand how to appropriate it, or if it should even be in consideration at all. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with understanding, where did Stoicism come from? Well, it came from a man by the name of Zeno. And Zeno was an individual who lived during the about 300 years prior to Christ. So we're talking about 334 to 262 BC. And he endured a shipwreck. And in this shipwreck near Athens, he discovered a copy of a book that was about Socrates, and he was very interested in it. Obviously, Socrates being one of the largest voices of the times, one of the most impactful philosophers of the time. In fact, many people would argue that he is the father of Western philosophy. This book really caught his attention, and it put him on a new path and a new quest for wisdom. And he would ultimately develop his own system of philosophy, if you will, while studying other philosophers of his time. Now, there were a few things that served as the foundation for Stoicism, and it was ethics, logic, and physics. Now, we may not be as familiar with physics or the logic portion of it, but it's important for us to know that logic, that is rationale and reason, hangs at the center, or exists at the center of this entire philosophical paradigm. And around it, if you will, would be the ideas of physics and the ideas of ethics. Today, what we're going to be considering is the ethical ideas of Stoicism as it pertains to practical living. Now, after Zeno introduced this idea, there was a very impactful individual who would come after him by the name of Seneca. Now, Seneca lived around the times of Jesus Christ. In fact, they would have been born around the same time. Seneca lived around 4 BC, and he died around 65 AD. So he had almost double the lifetime or the lifespan of Jesus Christ, but many people believe that he lived around the same time, Jesus being born around 3 AD. Now, Seneca, in contrast to Zeno, Seneca was a Roman statesman. He was a very popular writer. He was known as the Stoic moral teacher in many respects, and he was born in Spain, raised in Rome, and he acquired or became chronically ill. All right, he was chronically ill, and he experienced, as a part of his development, sort of political tension and turmoil, to be quite honest. It was just things were not going well. Now, he had a lot of money, he was rich, he was well off, but there were still some experiences there that made him want to pursue and embrace a lifestyle such as Stoicism. And it's important for us to at least first to acknowledge how these individuals are becoming exposed, they're encountering Stoicism, how they are embracing it. What drives them to this is the question. And that's what we want to highlight first before we actually determine and define what Stoicism is. Because what I want you to see, in every one of these circumstances, there is a problem, right? For Zeno, it was the fact that he was shipwrecked, right? For Seneca, it's the fact that he experienced an illness, and then also he's experiencing these political issues, and he's trying to find a way to deal with it as a human being. But then there's another person who probably is, I mean, Seneca was no slouch at all, but Epictetus was really one of the greater voices. In fact, he influenced some of the modern voices that reintroduced Stoicism to us here in the modern time. He was a slave, and he was the slave of a brutal master who would really abuse him and cause him to experience life under harsh conditions. And his ultimate goal was to overcome those conditions. And he would be very famous, should I say, for writing about self-control, writing about personal responsibility, writing about how to maintain some sort of control within a circumstance that is not favorable. But then there's lastly Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius was, he would become a Roman emperor, but he was born to be an emperor, if you will. He would ultimately become a ruler. It was very obvious. This idea of seeking wisdom would have been present even back in the days of Seneca, as emperors such as Nero were taught by philosophers all the time. Marcus Aurelius would have been introduced to the writings of Stoicism early on, and he would, as an emperor, he would actually as well embrace this sort of wisdom as a individual, but also as a ruler over an empire. The idea here was obviously to stay calm, consistent, and balanced, and that's where Stoicism came in. So here's the thing. All of these individuals have unique circumstances that they're facing that require them to overcome a situation, requires them to deal with less than fortunate circumstances, and they're looking for a philosophical, a rational approach to doing all of this. And the approach that they all sought to follow and they found some sort of solace in was Stoicism. And it is because Stoicism teaches that one should focus on what they control, not focus on the things that are outside of their control. So for instance, with Zeno, he would have said, listen, I've been shipwrecked. I can't control that. That was out of my control. But what I can control is how I respond to it. With Seneca, he would say, I was chronically ill. I went through this, I'm going through this political struggle, but I can't help that. I need to focus on what I can do to overcome this. What is within my control? Epictetus would have said, I was a slave. I am a slave. My master does not treat me with any sort of respect. That's not within my control. What can I do? Marcus Aurelius would say, listen, the empire is falling apart. There are things happening all around us. People are dying, but that's not something I can control. What can I control? And for us living in this world, we face the same thing. In fact, I'll be honest. After reading the book of Deuteronomy, after reading some of the things in the Gospels and even the letters of Paul, I myself would say, just like the Stoics, there are some things within my control, but there are things that are not. And I have even said before reading the philosophers that life is not made up of those things outside of your control, but rather it is made up of the things within your control. Meaning, yes, there may be things that happen to us that we cannot control, but that's not what makes up the total experience or the overall experience of our lives. It is rather the things that are within our control that determines the experience that we all encounter here on this earth. And it sounds very Stoic in a way, but I want to show you today that there is something uniquely different from how a Christian thinks versus how a Stoic thinks. And this is what makes Stoicism incredibly dangerous to a believer. Stoicism will tell you that yes, there are some things within your control and there are things outside of your control. But Stoics would say that for those things within your control, you should dig deep down inside to take control of it in order to, in a way, circumvent those things that are outside of your control, which is to say, you are given the ability to control your own destiny by digging inside and living by certain virtues. For Stoicism, those virtues would be wisdom, courage, self-control, and justice. If a person lives with these sort of characteristics, that is to say, good character, then they will be able to control certain things all things that are in their control, and therefore they will be able to take mastery over the things that are not within their control. You see? And who would not want to do that? Sounds very good. It actually sounds very Christian at times, especially when you're reading in the law and it tells you that life and death is in front of you. Choose you this day who you're going to serve. Choose life over death, prosperity over evil. You hear these kinds of things in the Bible, and when we hear Stoicism, we often say, yeah, actually, that is the truth. I do have the power to control my own destiny and to form my own reality because, yes, the power is within me. And here's where we run into the Apostle Paul. Because Paul existed during the time where Stoicism would have been probably the most popular that it will ever be. Surely, with Seneca's influence and the rise of Epictetus, it would have been a buzz around Athens in particular. And in Acts chapter 17, Paul goes to Athens and he encounters Epicureans and Stoics. And the Epicureans would believe that the ultimate aim of life is to find pleasure within reason, right? Rational thinking and living will lead us to have a pleasurable experience in life, and so that is the ultimate aim. Whereas Stoics would say the ultimate aim is to maintain discipline and control, to live in virtue and good character, and by that we will be afforded the ideal life, even among very harsh and terrible circumstances. Well, Paul comes in saying, wait a minute, actually, we have to take a closer look at this. Yes, life is filled with all sorts of evils, and yes, we are all subject to things that are within and without our control. But there's one thing you all are leaving out, and that is the reality and the transformation that happens through Jesus Christ. Okay? And for Paul, it is not within that a person finds their ability to overcome the evils of the world, but it is through life that is transformed into the image and by the power of Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit. You see, the thing missing in the Stoic paradigm is actually the existence of God. It is the assistance of God. It is the power of God. For Stoics, the power is within themselves. And the gods, whoever he is, but it's not even a he, it is an it. Whatever it is somewhere influencing things in a way that is not personal. But for Paul's God, Jesus Christ himself, is personally involved, intimately involved in the life of his followers. So that even when they don't have it within to overcome whatever the struggle may be, they find their strength in Jesus Christ, the resurrected Savior. All right? Now, what this means is actually pretty powerful. First thing, if you look in Acts chapter 17, verse 24, it means that God, the one who made the world, is a personal being. Because he says, God who made the world and everything in it, He is Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve him, for he has no needs. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. You see the difference? You see, in Stoicism, you have to satisfy your own needs. And I think it's a very dangerous position that we are entering in this idea of modern Stoicism, where we think the answers abide within ourselves. No, no, no. It can't. We can't help ourselves, is what Paul is saying here. We need a God, particularly the one who created everything and controls everything, to help us and to satisfy us. That's the first thing. So the first thing is God, who created the world, satisfies our needs. Okay? He's personally there. But then the second thing is, it says in verse 26, from one man he created all the nations throughout the whole world, and he decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, and he determined their boundaries. So you see, whereas the universe of sorts would influence, or maybe not so much influence, the life of a person, because they're not really, the universe is not concerned with the welfare or the well-being of human beings. Paul's God, the resurrected Jesus Christ, he says, is actually in control of what rises and falls. So the second idea, aside from God the Creator being intimately involved with the needs of his followers, it is this God who determines the course of things that happen in this world. Okay? So we see here that there is a creator God who is all involved with everything, even your life, right? Now, the third thing is probably the most important, one of the most important at least, is the purpose of this God. Paul argues that our God, the believer's God, the believer of Jesus Christ, God, his purpose is so that the nations will seek him, meaning he wants to be pursued. He wants to be in relationship. Okay? So here's the thing, friends. Stoicism leaves you to be God. It leaves you to fix your life. It leaves you to order the course of the world in many respects, even if that just means your world. But according to Paul, Paul says that there is a God who wants the nations to seek after him, even though he's not far away from us. This actually attacks the idea of the Epicurean's God being somewhere stuck in the sky, and the Stoic's God being made of some sort of form, some sort of nature, like nature, the laws of nature, if you will, just organizing things as it should be. No, this God is very personal. He steps within his creation and he invites you to follow him. So for Paul, in contrast to the philosophers of Stoicism, Paul would say, no, actually, we have a God who created everything. He determines the course of what he creates, and he desires to be sought after. And it is through this God, that it is through living for this God, it is through submitting to this God, we find the sort of transformation that makes life meaningful, purposeful, and actually enjoyable, right? So if we were to ask Paul, in contrast to what the philosophers of Stoicism would say, that we need to dig deep down, and that also, we can't control what happens, we just have to control what is within our control. Paul will say yes to all of that, but there's a simple caveat. There's a very unique difference. While we may not be able to control the things in our life, and while there may be some things that we're within control, we have to control over, Paul will say, over all those things is the Creator God. It is the God who sent his Son to die on a cross so that we can experience the victory that we cannot achieve for ourselves. And this is what makes modern Christians following Stoicism so dangerous, because it puts us in a position to depend on ourselves when we should be depending on the work of Jesus Christ. That's where it gets dangerous. We should be depending on the work of Jesus Christ, both to transform us and to deliver us from whatever it is we can never deliver ourselves from. Well, there are a few things that come to mind. How about sin? Right? How about the oppression that comes from living as a believer and living within the character of Christ? All of these things are struggles that we must overcome, but we can never overcome by ourselves. So, friends, what I invite you to do is I invite you to study intently the Gospels and find the sort of relief and power that can only come from living in the power of Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit. Not relying on yourself, not relying on your own self-discipline or your own ability to control things within your control and leave the rest to nothing, right? But rather, even for those things that are outside of your control, submit it to God and know that there's power in the resurrection of Jesus Christ to overcome those things.